drive a conversation. I want the conversation to sort of just be a bit natural and oriented around the topic. So we're in the the second session of a contextualized education conversation. Got video rolling, and so those of you who are going to watch, I'll try and make sure I repeat the things discussed and bounced around from folks sitting in the room. That way you all can hear it. Okay, so last week we set a foundation. We said contextualized education is based on some information from the parables. I'm debating on whether or not I want to write this on the board. I've done a lot of that today. Jesus brings us a content in the storyline that he gives us, and we marry the content he gave us to a context in our life. And it's in that back and forth, these two things laid alongside each other, that we draw things out of the parables and we learn. When it comes to education in our classrooms, we do the same kinds of things with our content: biology, history, bib studies, math, science. So the premise comes to us from the parables. We need an anchor in our content, is what we talked about last time, so that our kids with their context can't run too far. Here's kind of where we left off then. What contexts in the lives of our students matter for their education and for our teaching in a classroom?
I think a couple things. I think they need to be able to connect new content with old content.
Okay.
To be able to make sense of it, to be able to draw a line. And I also think they need to be able to connect their content to, it's helpful if they can connect it to something personal.
Okay. So personal context outside of the classroom. There is a layer of context when we talk about education that is content to content connection, right? And so sometimes contextualizing involves bridging the gap between something they already know and some new thing, or some skill set they have with some new piece of information or some new approach. The personal piece, what personal contexts matter when a student comes into our classroom? Remember, we said context is their cares and concerns, and content is like the academic material. So what cares and concerns in the life of a student matter when they show up in our classroom?
I was just going to say their cares and concerns matter.
Right, it's all of it. And that's hard, right? So if a student's life at home is chaotic and disorganized and disheveled and messy, do we see that show up in our classroom?
Yes.
How does it show up? Mrs. Pitt says, yes, we see it show up in our classroom. How do we see it show up? Give me some of those markers that you pick up on and say, the support network's not there at home. Things are...
There's a disconnection in the discipline, the authority.
Okay.
Respecting authority.
So how they respond to authority?
Yes.
They're tired.
Okay. They're tired because for a lot of our teenagers without some structure at home, they have free reign instead of a more disciplined environment that allows them things like good nutrition and sleep. There's a handful of students that pop right off of my mind when I think about that.
Well, I think also, is that a lot of our students live in two different environments. They're
Okay.
transitioning from one home to the next.
Okay, so broken home environment
Yes.
matters for
I get
their
that.
context. How do we see that show up in a classroom? I'm imagining issues. Say what? Disorganized,
Yeah.
right? They've got some stuff over here, they've got some stuff over there. Their life is some over here
Right.
and some over there. And so it's reflected in their student experience in the academics,
Lack of focus.
right? Sometimes, so the lack of focus will show up too. Sometimes that issue with authority, because their system of authority at home is in a cohesive whole. It's a bit broken. It's not functioning like the biblical design, which all of us have a part of our life that's like that. I'm not trying to like pick on some of our families here, but what other cares and concerns? Okay. Student life contexts outside of this place that make students angry or frustrated. How many? There's a handful, I think, that come through by the time they get to their senior year that are just sort of generally frustrated with school, with life, with lack of freedoms. How does that manifest itself in a classroom? Besides them just sort of generally being grumpy and gruff. What does it do to their academics? What do we see in their work?
They're less responsive, I know that.
Okay. They're less responsive in the classroom.
Apathetic or oppositional.
Yes.
Apathetic or oppositional.
Give you bare minimum.
Okay. Yeah, they go short.
Yeah.
It's done. I'm out the door. I don't want to mess with it. Okay.
Especially when you have seen their potential and then, you see that they got it in the next assignment.
Something-
Weaker.
Yes. Something changes.
If it's always consistently weak, then that could just be an academics student struggling. But if you see how good they are, then the next assignment's weak. They didn't put as much effort into it as they could have.
Okay.
There's something else I see too, that they lie fast when you ask them how they're doing, and they sound fine. And you can see it and you can feel it that they aren't fine.
Yeah.
And I just experienced this with the student, which was one of the reasons I was saying, was I knew the person was lying. So finally I said, I guess because in their life they have not had people that really care. So when you come into contact with someone who really cares,
Yeah.
and you're not saying I care because I want something from you, it's because I want to introduce you to somebody who can help you with your situation.
Right.
And if the person kept saying, I'm okay, and I said, no, you're not, something is wrong. And finally he broke. Well, not today, that was yesterday. He told me. But it was neat the way he went about telling me. He pointed out some flaws that I had. It was something I said that he felt very comfortable to tell me the way he interpreted, which wasn't the way I meant it. And he said, I don't think you didn't. And so I said, something is going on within you. What is it going on? So finally he broke and just shared with me what it was. Came in today totally different.
Yeah, our student cares and concerns. We get, in my experience, we get one of two. They'll either freely share if we've got a rapport and they trust us, or if they don't have that yet, or if they're still working on it, or they're just in general a more guarded person, I'm fine.
Yeah.
And they'll sort of keep everybody at arm's length. And tendency in classwork I see is that those students who are inclined to do that because of issues in a life context, it affects the depth or the willingness to engage, or they don't necessarily care. Now, do they care about learning? And do they care about being the kind of people God wants them to be? Or do they just not care about a grade and the routine and the stuff of school?
They don't have the capacity to care about those things if their social emotional needs aren't being met.
It's fair. And so social emotional needs need to be met. And our kids need to feel like they have a safe space at home. Like this is a safe place to be as well. And like their context and their life outside of the classroom is a healthy one, at least to some extent. And this is where we've sort of got differentiation as a method And we've got contextualized education on one hand and social emotional learning and the tools that are associated with it on the other. And I'm not the expert social emotional learning. That's probably more like a Rachel Porter question, because that's just not where I spent my time. I spent my time on the academic side of the pulling from life contexts to discuss in an academic environment. But these two things are sort of like the two ends of a teeter-totter, with differentiation as the guide in the middle. Okay, so this gets to that why question. Context matters. The cares and concerns of our students outside of our classrooms matter because it shapes the way they're going to engage in our classroom, if they're going to engage in our classroom. It shapes their overall health, mentality. We can talk worldview now, especially in the realm of something like biblical studies, or in a Christian school, we can talk worldview now, because now we're worldview shaping and putting those building blocks together for what life looks like as a teenager, that are going to start to be set in concrete for where that's going to lead them in major life choices and decisions going forward, or as teenagers, as they encounter things they either should engage with but don't, or they should avoid but don't avoid because of what we're talking about. Okay. How do we I want to reword the question. I'm struggling to figure out how to do it. How do we uncover or unpack those cares and concerns or those contexts in order to make, well, let's just stop there. How do we uncover or unpack some of those cares, concerns, and contexts for our students? Yep.
Making them more important than what the content.
Okay. Making our students more important about teaching our content. Remembering we're teaching people, not just talking about stuff. Getting to know our students, I think, is critical. So we show up at the extra functions, or we greet them as they come in the door. We spend time at certain strategic moments asking about how things are going for them. I check in with my sophomores because sophomore year is typically really crazy. They've got some heavier content on their plates, and they're struggling to keep it all together because their group of teachers as sophomores tends to amp up you guys need to own this now. And just stopping and saying, you guys look a little frazzled. What's going on? And discussing some of that, getting a read on what's happening in the room, which is always a lot easier to do without these on. Talking to our kids in the hallway. Getting to know them so that we can see when there's an issue. Getting to know them for the sake of having conversation with them. I think, go back and remember what it was like to be a teenager. Did you feel understood? Did you feel understood by yourself? Did you understand yourself? I didn't. She's just that awesome. She understood herself.
I wasn't that deep.
No, I felt like a fish out of water. I felt awkward. I still feel that way, but maybe that's just me. Did you feel understood by your parents?
Well, I was just figuring things out. My dad's a pastor, so I just remember a lot of times having that person there and running into religious questions. Like, what about this? What about that?
Okay.
It was great. This was really before Google was the big deal.
It was a different time.
Yeah, it was.
I mean,
No, it was.
I had a great conversation with my mom. That was, I said, and that's the way it goes, but Mom we could kind of, and we had family devotions on every week.
Yeah.
So we had that opportunity. Dad was more in the academic part of it. He would show up in our classrooms and just sit in the back
Yeah.
and see what we was doing and talk about things like that. He was
Okay.
a pastor after I graduated.
Our parents didn't have phones.
No, they didn't. So in the evening,
You're right.
we had, and there were tables.
Neither did we.
We ate together. We ate together every evening. Nobody ate by themselves. Everybody
Yeah.
ate as a family.
Okay. Do you think the group of teenagers we teach feel understood by the adults in their life?
More no than yes.
Yeah.
What has happened? What's the disconnect? Why do they not feel that way?
I don't think that important adult people in their life are always as present for them.
Okay, so adults and our presence, we're not as present to today's teenagers as maybe the adults in our life.
And they're not as
were.
present to us.
No.
Fair?
It's,
Nobody's as present to anybody anymore because we're always in front of a screen of some kind. As wonderful as this technology is and as great as it is, it disconnects things, right? It makes it more complicated. I have a really interesting perspective because I'm old enough to know that I don't fit in with the teenagers who sit in my classroom, but I'm also young enough to have lived through that transition and to have watched the screen generation start. And the students I went to high school with, we didn't necessarily have phones, or we didn't have phones like we have now. We didn't have that. But I also went to a large public high school in California, like 5,000 high school students. My graduating class was like 850 kids, 900 when you count the kids, almost 950 when you count the kids that graduated over the summer. And we were the smallest class on campus. And the general feel of us as teenagers was sort of the shifting tide of that technology, I think, was carrying a shift. 9/11 happened during my high school years as well, and so that marks a pretty big transition. It's a whole host of American civil rights issues that started shortly after my high school tenure. And so there was this start to a shift of the older generation doesn't understand those of us sort of coming of age, high school and college. And that divide of the older generation doesn't understand us, I think, is just widening in today's society. So an approach like contextualized education tries to get to know our students in order to establish that kind of presence. If part of the disconnect is that there's a lack of presence from people who matter in the lives of our students, then this is part of why they disengage when it comes to their academics. I did a breakdown in my dissertation on how many students had had my class for more than 1 year. And the overwhelming percentage of my kids had me for at least 3. And that, I think, gives you the kind of time to move slowly but establish context. If you're only going to see them for a year and then they're going to move on, or you're only going to see them for a semester and then they're going to move on to somebody else, our time to establish our presence in their lives gets truncated pretty hard. How do we establish that presence and make those connections? Let's start there. How do we establish that presence and make those connections?
Well, we listen, we allow them to have a voice.
Okay, listening and allowing a voice. The second one I'm going to come back to.
We know what's going on, we follow up, we do little things. I know you're a baseball player, how'd the game go?
Right. We follow up with them when we know there's something going on that they're involved with or that they're interested in. Strike up a conversation about what they think about a certain topic. I got a student who's tremendously interested and involved in politics. Tell me what you're thinking. Let's talk about it.
Because anybody can ask, how are you? And they can say,
Mhm.
how are you?
Yeah.
But if you say,
Yeah.
I heard you were,
Tell me about this, right? And it's something that has a personal connection. Yeah. Making them a part of something is creating a culture in our classroom that that tries to close the gap from I'm up here and I talk about stuff you need to know, and you're out there and sit in the seats. And contextualized education works when you establish that kind of partnership and you close that instructional gap, that instructional distance between I stand up here distant at the board and I talk about stuff and I make notes and you guys are over here. And that's at the core of what we're talking about in contextualized education. All of this outside matters. And I may not necessarily be able to get to know every single student in all of those pieces of care and concern from their world, because I may not have the time to talk to all of them in the course of the school days in those deep and abiding and personal conversations.
you can share about yourself though, and even though you haven't made those
You're right.
one-on-one connections, the more they hear about your faith and your walk with the Lord and the things you're doing.
You're right.
Obviously, there's that line, student-teacher relationship, but if you've ever watched someone who's famous or listened to a podcast over and over again or something, you feel like you know that person.
That's right.
Because you have engaged and listened to them so often. And I think that students can feel that way. Have to share.
You're right. So instead of it inviting students into something where we learn about them in some capacity, the other way around works really well. And that's part of where I was going to go. And so sharing information about us, our journey, our walk, I turn getting to know me for my students into a quiz. And it's a game that we play, and it's how many questions of this can you get right? And the goal is that I have questions that they have no business knowing any of this information. And they're goofy and they're random and they're off the wall. And the point is they don't know the answers. But what happens when I ask the question, because it works like this, do you know? And then I fill in the blank. And they're supposed to pretend like they know and write down what they think the answer would be based on what they've experienced of me in the classroom and how they know those interactions flow and work. Their answers show me something about what they're thinking and where they're at, and we get a feel. The guard comes down in the room because I'm not asking them those personal questions, even if they're rather innocuous, like what's your favorite song? There's a pressure to share that because it's a personal preference, and they're not sure how it's going to be received by me or by the rest of the room, especially if that, for some of our students, especially if that favorite song's not like a CCS approved or CCS appropriate, or it's not on the lists of things that are, those kinds of things. But if they ask, if I'm staging a question and then sharing something about myself, and they're engaged in that back and forth, the guard in the room comes down and the interaction gets light, and I'm picking up on where my students are at, and they're getting a feel for who I am. And now we're setting a culture in the classroom that says, this is a space where I'm safe to share with them, and will at some point in time turn around to where they're now okay to talk to me or ask me a question, even if it's for a friend, which is one of the common ones I get. Asking for a friend, or I have a friend who wants to know. Well, let's talk about it. Here's what I might tell your friend. Okay. That rapport and that closing that instructional gap and inviting them into some process early on in a classroom setting that has the the two parties, students and the teacher in the room, talking back and forth and sharing things back and forth, that's at the heartbeat of what I do in my class because of my subject matter for contextual ed. So if we want to look at a parable, we'll read it together and then I'll ask questions, but I won't provide answers, at least not initially. And what I'm trying to do is draw in discussion by framing the discussion around something we can share together in the narrative of the story. So I lost my train of thought. The next step to that is typically to ask them to write something. That next step and the writing normally involves a personal question. Who do you see yourself as in the parable? Why? And I build from that as a kind of foundation into other questions that ask them to do other pieces in the analysis and in the breakdown of the parable. Early in my year, I'll ask my students, what works for you in a classroom? What doesn't work for you in a classroom? What's helpful? And how do I help you in this class? That's invited them in to have input in the way class is going to flow. And when our students feel like they have that input, and that we actually, here's the tricky part, we actually have to take it and do something with it to change the way we would normally do things or to modify what we would normally do to meet some of those student needs from time to time, then they feel like that partnership is an actual partnership and we're not just sort of giving lip service to it. Is that making any sense whatsoever? Okay. This is Walter Wink's whole big platform, and this is what he builds his whole thing on. The content expert in the room is us as teachers. But the people with the cares and the concerns that the content needs to connect with are our students in the room. And so that partnership has to be brought together in a way that's grounded, like we talked about last week, but that matters personally to the students that we have. And there's two layers to that. One is just the personal contact of a personal experience in a classroom where they care about a teacher and the teacher cares about them. And two, the strategic pieces of like the educational method. Okay. I want to focus on the strategic educational method pieces. Does that make sense? You okay with that? Processing? Okay.
That makes sense.
It's hard to read faces with masks on. I've been doing it all year and I still hate it. Okay. It's the look of I'm thinking about what you're saying that doesn't always look like I'm thinking about what you're saying because I can't see the rest of your facial expression. And on some of my students, I'm like, are you angry with me? Or are you thinking about what I said? And that was okay. Let's do this. Let's build a class discussion. We're going to do it from the ground up, and we're going to try and create a sort of contextualized class discussion. Mrs. Stone, help us. Give us a topic from a science class that you've taught that would involve you and students in a discussion about something. Or you could do in a discussion, sort of Socratic back and forth.
Okay. How specific do you want to be? I'd like to talk about genetics.
Genetics. Okay, so genetics is our topic. You're going to do
Heredity.
So
Inherited traits.
what would, if we're going to do an introductory lesson into that genetics topic, we want to talk about traits, let's do that. So we're talking hereditary traits. I think I said that correctly.
I usually start with looking around the room at the things that we have You know, how many of you can roll your tongue? Try this. How many of you have a widow's
Okay.
peak? Let me see. Pull your head back. How many of you can do this? You know,
Okay. So the conversation of these traits in a genetics class starts with an exercise of how many of you can do these things. Are you looking for the number of kids and sort of the commonalities in the room?
no, I'm just trying to get them to
Connect
Yes,
something
yeah.
from their set of traits to the eventual topic. Okay. Can we? Okay.
You can tweak it if that's not.
No. That works really well because now do I or don't I becomes a personal connection. You could do that with a discussion and a series of just ask back and forth. You could do that between partners, just restructuring the same practice. With your partner, figure out one or both of you these traits. Do you have widow's peak, right? Can you roll your tongue? Hitchhiker's thumb versus not, right? And we can walk that. If you're going to build beyond that introduction, what are you going to try and tie in to that set as we go beyond an introductory unit? What do we do
Talk
next?
about the terms that they use to describe things and then help them see that there are actual genetic terms to replace their common language about things, and here are the terms.
Okay.
So because in order for us to go deeper, they have to understand the vocabulary.
Okay, so in order to get adjusted to the specific scientific vocabulary that we need, we start with our common terms and the way that we would talk about it or describe it. And then we take that language and we shift it to the scientific terms that would work for it. We're contextualizing. We're taking something that's common to their care, concern, or experience. We're linking something from what's happened in the classroom, care, concern, and experience, to do you actually have or not have these sets of traits? And now we're moving that to the specific content of a set of terminology. Their interest is always the great contextualizer. Do they care? Are they concerned about learning what we're talking about? And so we can have cares and concerns in our classroom that are varied and diverse and present challenges because they come from a home life and they're overbearing on a student in our room. We can also have cares and concerns like, is that my experience? Do I share these traits? And then we can move from that into talking about the terminology. Okay. Social studies. We're going to talk economics and the stock market. How do we contextualize? Because I think you already do it. I'm putting you on the spot, but I think you already.
How do we connect that
Yep.
to their lives?
How do we connect?
I mean, with the stock market, it's kind of straightforward. They can just usually make some money off of the investments.
Sure.
So that could affect the future. Right now, we're in personal finance unit, so
Okay.
it's pretty contextualized as it is because they
Okay.
see the importance of it. Hence the name personal.
Yeah. The personal connection of how I earn and what I do with the money I have drives an engagement, hopefully, in learning the specifics and the content. Do your classes play a stock market game? That's a contextualizer. Do kids like to play games? And do they like to compete with each other? And do they like to be the best at anything or something? Absolutely 100%. Your kids go nuts over playing that game every time your classes play that stock market game. It's all they can talk about. It's like the fall. I think it's in the fall. I don't remember when they do it. Whenever they do it, it's like
all year, or all semester.
Perfect.
It's for econ, so it started this
Yep.
in January.
Okay.
Yeah.
They talk about the stock market game and they compare how they're doing with their peers like they talk about Nerf wars. They won't not talk about it. I have to make them not talk about playing the stock market game so that I can do class. You've contextualized it.
Yeah. And I have them compete with the other classes too. It's all one big group, so they're not just competing with each other, but
But it's contextualized now. They care about how well that works in your class and understanding how to manipulate it and make it work for their benefit because you've got them competing and ranking. And are they in partners or groups of some kind? No? Okay, it's individual. But they're in dialogue with each other about they've got these stocks and I've got these stocks and this one's working and this one's not, and when did you sell this? And they're collaborating on it. They're talking about it and they're working through it, but they automatically care and their care level goes way up because it's a game. It's you've contextualized it. You've connected to something in them that cares about what you're doing in your content, and that drives them into how does this work and how do I make it work so that I'm the best at it. It's a grand contextualizer.
So they can see the rankings, and so when they see someone doing really well, then everyone's going to that person. It's like, what are you investing in?
Right.
They want to know their tips and what they're in.
Okay. Being able to see how you're doing in that competition and knowing who's doing well, then it drives them to collaborate with each other. This is all kinds of differentiated stuff in there. And there's all kinds of learning and the collaboration pieces and how do I make it work? And they're now engaged in asking questions and discovering. They're actively participating in the learning process that involves that thing, right? That in a structural sort of content piece is a way to contextualize. It works. I wish I had a math person in here because I don't have a clue how to contextualize parabolas other than throwing stuff in the air.
Lisa McCain is really good at making math contextualized. Just all kinds of practical things, money and time and
Right.
things I can't think of.
Math is involved in so much of what we do. High school math and pre-calculus and graphing stuff in Algebra 2 feels so disconnected from our kids' experiences. They have a hard time. Why does it matter? If they're not the driven kid to get the best marks on the best of everything and go to the Ivy League school, then for a lot of kids, they'll do that because they can, but it's more grind than enjoyment and engagement. And that's part of what contextualized education is trying to take some of that pressure off of those kids who are going to succeed or those kids who are struggling to succeed by moving them out of that category where it's just sort of like, yeah, okay, I'll get through it, and into a category where there's something more life-giving in what they're experiencing in the room. Mrs. Pitts, you're going to do a discussion of a topic in your class. How do you bring student cares and concerns into the content, into the topic?
I don't know, Mr. Miller, but I can do it every day. No, actually, I was going to ask you, do you think it's a little easier for us to contextualize in Bible and other academic classes? I'm asking you a question with what you asked me, but.
Mrs. Pitts is asking if she thinks it's a little bit easier to do that in our biblical studies classes than it is to do that in other classes. Messing with my head. Yes and no. Yes, because there's still a culture at this school that our kids care about what the Bible says. And so they care. For some of our students, they really do want to know what's in there and what depth is there. And so inviting them into something that helps them discover that, they care about it. No, because it's still school. No, because some of their Christian background they haven't yet gotten to the point where the roots are deep enough for them to care and be self-starters. And so it can easily become, I'll do it, I'll get it done, I'll get the grade, and then I'll get out the door, as opposed to that kind of life-giving, rich and flourishing piece that it can be. So yeah, I think so in some aspects. I also don't know a ton about biology, and so it's always easier for me to contextualize my stuff than your stuff. But that's just because I don't know biology. The more I hear you talk about it, the more I realize, yeah, so in biology, it might actually be really easy. In anatomy and physiology, it's really easy. We talk about how this personally matters to us and people with these sorts of conditions that we know and love and care about.
It's also really easy to connect, sorry, but it's
No.
really easy to connect the life sciences with your faith and with
It is.
God's
Yeah.
design.
No, you're right.
Fingerprints are all over it.
Yeah, you're right. In biblical studies, in my classes, I think, yeah, it's a bit easier than it would be in math or chemistry. But that's also because, sorry, Mrs. Granger, I remember very little from my high school chemistry class. I think it's easier because I can invite them into talking about something that's on the pages. And we can share a care and a concern about what the stuff on the pages of the Bible has to say. And I do a lot of just asking them questions.
My reason for asking that was because I find that it's real easy for me, and I'm not looking for ease and comfort.
Yeah.
With my junior high students,
Okay.
they seem to be more open and engaged than my high school classes. And these are some students that I had actually in 7th and 8th grade.
Mm-hmm.
But I see a switch in high school.
Okay.
They're more laid back and they will not connect and they know the answers. But they've had you and Miss Miller, they know,
yeah.
But they just sit there. But I think it took time for them to they knew me from 7 and 8, and I had to look at them past 7 and 8 and see them that they are juniors and seniors now.
Yeah.
So I think it's the way I looked at them.
Okay.
Because I was so used to them responding when they went in the lower grade. Now here they are, juniors and seniors. And for example, like today, we were talking about the old covenant, and that the priest went in to offer sacrifice, once a year. And I made a mistake and said, one student said, well, they do it once a week. And I said, no, and then Brianna said, that's a lot of animals they sacrifice once a week.
Yeah.
And Hannah was brave enough to say, Mrs. Chris, I think it was once a year. And I said, you know what? You are so right. I said, when I said it, I said, I went like, well, I don't think that's really right. But 2 or 3, I would say in the beginning, she wouldn't have said that. Because I told her, I stand to be corrected. And, if I make an error or something, I won't tell you all the truth. So I see that more like in junior high, we start off with our true identity.
Okay.
And we really can, I share with them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I see. And I'm going to back up a little bit because all we're talking about, I just hear this one word, love. If we as teachers, if those students find out that when they enter into that classroom and with the attitude, I have an advantage, and I'm not saying it, pat myself on the back, I've been here for a long time. I've taught a lot of their parents and their sisters and their brothers, and those students there's a reputation they should put up with. So they come in expecting me to be funny, making them laugh, and be crazy. And so, it's not something I make up, that's just my personality. I like to make people laugh, and I like to laugh myself. And so they get, within 2 to 3 weeks, we and we get some learning doing.
Yep.
Some, not a lot.
Yeah.
We get enough for them to know truly who they are, their true identity as we go through the character traits. And then they have to, at the end of the school year, do a PowerPoint presentation on the one character trait that they know they have mastered this.
Got it.
And why they did that.
I'm gonna
And thought the whole
I'm gonna
class-
nutshell that a little bit for our online viewers. Mrs. Pitts is talking about it's a little bit easier to engage with her junior high students. Her high school students tend to be a little bit more reserved, laid back. I want to explore that, and maybe we have time to. So if we're talking about class discussions, finding personal ways to bring them in, do we share these things? Playing games of some kind. Asking questions and having them write responses and then talk about what they wrote is a common practice in my room. So we typically start with a question. Like we were looking at Genesis chapter 3 today for how we know what we know as we create our own credo sort of statements in philosophy. And so we're looking at how do we know, what do they know prior to the fall? How do they know that information? And so I asked them a question today, what do they learn? What changes in what they learn and what they're aware of after they eat the fruit from the tree? And they wrote some things down and then we talked it through. What do you notice that they notice is different? And now I've got students sharing their insight on what's going on, and I can take those pieces and build from it. It helps when I can refer back to what somebody says in the classroom, and I can say, you mentioned this earlier, and now somebody over here is mentioning this. How do you think these two things go together? And we're sort of putting it together as it's like building a Lego set, but in the conversation, in the dialogue, and using what they bring to the table invites them in to bring information to the table. It's slow and it's awkward and it's hard when I have a new group of students to establish that and to pull that out and to bring them into that. But it needs that relationship. They need the time to figure out this is an okay place, that I'm an okay person, that this is an all right thing to figure out and work through. But once that's there, then I can pull from them and we can craft and create those bigger picture things. Class discussions, I think, are a bit easier. What about assignments? How do we contextualize what we do as far as assignments go? How do we bring their cares and concerns and our content together in an assignment, in a paper, in a report, in a lab, in any of all of the above?
I think you can vary your mode. In other words, it can be visual, auditory.
So we change
kinesthetic.
that style to meet those learning styles. Visual learners, kinesthetic learners, okay?
Can we make it like an in-classroom assignment? Where they are working in the classroom?
We can.
Out of the classroom assignments.
Okay, we can. Change the context of where and when they do the assignment. We can. How do we invite them to bring their care and concern to our topic?
Writing is a good way.
Writing is a great way. Telling a story is a good way.
Role play.
The role play is a big one, and it's really been successful in my philosophy class. My students in that philosophy class create a character at the beginning of the year, and they do all of their assignments through the lens of the character they created. And so Johnny, who sits in my classroom, second bell for philosophy, has created a character who's a medieval knight. And the whole experience of what he learns in my classroom comes through the experience of this medieval knight. And so when he writes or when he talks or when he's presenting the material as I ask for it in certain assignments, he has to filter what he's doing through the perspective of his character. And they're supposed to be reflections of themselves. And I tell them up front, this is supposed to be a reflection of you, but it's also supposed to distance you from what we do just a smidgen. So you have to think about it in a little bit of a different way. But here's what I've noticed with that particular character project. For some of our students who wouldn't ask certain questions or wouldn't make certain statements or wouldn't admit that they were wrestling or struggling with something, their character will say it all day long. So a student sitting in my room may not say that they're doubting whether or not God is really there, or they're struggling with their personal experience with God and this, that, or the other, but they'll let their character say it.
Asking for a friend.
That's right. Yeah. If they can withdraw and be safe, but their character can be raw and vulnerable because it's a character, they'll do it. And so I get to see pieces and elements and parts of that student's care and concern for a topic like right and wrong when we do some ethics stuff, or like how do we know that God exists, or what do we know about the beginning of the universe, and how do we discern that information. When their character talks about it, I see and hear things in their character's presentation that I don't always get to see and hear from the student. But part of the character's expression in that project is embedded in that kid. And they're not necessarily willing to say it, but their character will say it. And so finding ways to craft our assignments that invite them to layer an experience of our content, to be a biblical character instead of being themselves. My New Testament students write a story like, see, the Bible is so easy to do stories. So we do stories. My New Testament students write a story like they're a 16-year-old when Nebuchadnezzar destroys the temple, and they're going to be an 86-year-old, which is way past the life expectancy. I tell them it's a miracle. Just roll with the story. You're a 16-year-old and you go into exile. You're an 86-year-old when you come home 70 years later. What's your story like? Write me some vignettes, some little snippets. What's the experience like? Talk me through it. And now they've got to unpack it. For a lot of my upper level classes, we'll read a story and then I just ask them questions. Or we read a poem and I ask them questions. And sometimes I let them write, and sometimes I guide them through, and sometimes I want the popcorn sort of dialogue and the back and forth. But trying to invite them in and establishing something with them that has a focus on something that isn't themselves really does sort of, you have to start figuring out how to look for it and how to find it, but they'll show it to you. It's there. Story works well for history. Being a character, like it works well for the Bible. Being a character from a given time period and recrafting a story as if a lived experience has worked for them. Yeah, go ahead.
In the junior high class, we do a lot of self-evaluation.
Okay.
Every unit.
Self-check and self-evaluation.
Where, it's easy for me to point my finger at you, but I love the fact that everything is being taught. I teach it. We do all of the assignments together and all, and then they do a self-evaluation versus a test on where am I here, and plus the parent is invited in. The parents do a self-evaluation and they compare what dad and mom said about their compared to what, which takes us back to the beginning of the story. Your character, who are we?
That's right.
Who am I? And it happened. So it really has helped a lot of the messages, self-evaluation and parent evaluation.
Right.
Most cases, it lined up with what I see
Sure.
in the classroom, which is it's really a big help.
Self-evaluation paired with evaluations from people they care about in their lives, and then comparing those things. They could do peer evaluations as well. That'd be another strategy or tactic in that. We gotta be careful with that, I think, if we're talking about peers. Some of our students who are concerned about how they're perceived by their peers. So those kinds of peer evaluations, or even just having, I always absolutely hated it when a teacher made me share my quiz with somebody else and take somebody else's and like grade for the teacher and marks. That was the worst. That was one of the worst possible things you could do to me as a kid. Just take it and grade it yourself. I don't even care what the score is. Just don't let, Johnny 2 doors down see it, because now he knows how well I did on the quiz, and I'm going to hate that. That was always something that was nerve-wracking for me. So there's a bit of a fine line here. We want to invite students into something, and we want them to share cares and concerns as they meet our content. We also need to navigate carefully so we don't overstep and create tension where we're trying to alleviate tension. The goal is finding ways to take the tension off, to take the weight off, so that our students can shift from grinding through their education in a given classroom to being engaged because they enjoy what transpires. There's a couple of ideas, and it's 4:15, and so I want to be mindful of our time. There's a couple of things I just wanted to reiterate. So Mrs. Pitts, number one, loving on our students. Mrs. Stone, you said some of the material like this as well. Being present and available to them in genuine ways goes so much further than we think it will. But it takes a lot of time for us to develop that presence and to show them we love and we care about them. It's not just the one-time ask about how the baseball game went. It's repeated check-ins. It's pats on the back and high fives in the hallway, and it's treating them and inviting them in like they're people and like they matter, and not like they're just students who sit in our room who learn stuff and then shuffle out the door again. And that takes time, and it takes intentionality, and it takes energy from us, especially those of us that are introverts, in really connecting with our kids as people, not just as students. The second is those practical bits and pieces of how do we introduce them to something that links. Playing a game with the stock market, great. It'll carry you and your engagement in some of what you do in your content for a while. And then the fun of it will carry as they play the game, but they need another piece layered in later to reconnect and to re-engage context and content. And so it doesn't have to be in every single day all the time, but it needs to be scattered in enough that they're willing to come and engage it. Sometimes when we craft and create assignments, giving our students choices, choosing to do this or do that and let them play to their strengths, leaving format more creative. Here's what I want you to do, and I want you to explain this. If the way that you see it and picture it works better in slides, great, here's what I would need. If it works better in a document, great, here's what I would need. If you need something else, let's talk about it. And opening that up for them to have an expression besides just a written form that's sort of stock and paper-like. They own part of that now, and that brings them in. It engages them. It draws them into what we're talking about. They may still struggle to like fully enjoy a study on Galatians, but they at least care about the medium they're using to do the expression. And so the way they bring their tools and resources to it, it helps some of that engagement and some of that context. Okay, we'll stop there because we're out of time.
Thank you.
I hope